Millionaire comes home unexpectedly and freezes at what the nanny was teaching his son. The private jet descended smoothly onto the runway, its wheels kissing the tarmac as the sun dipped below the horizon. Alexander Drake stared out of the window, his sharp blue eyes scanning the familiar skyline. For the past 6 months, he had been hopping from one country to another, sealing multi-million-dollar deals and overseeing the expansion of his tech empire. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he felt an ache, a pull that demanded he return home. Alexander was not a man of sentiment. After losing his wife, Claire, 3 years ago, he had thrown himself entirely into his work, delegating the care of his son, Liam, to an army of staff. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, a gnawing guilt had taken root. He could barely recall the sound of his 7-year-old's laughter or the warmth of his hugs. Claire would have hated what he had become. The car ride from the private airstrip to his estate was a blur. Alexander checked his phone, scrolling through the endless emails that awaited him, but his thoughts drifted to Liam. When was the last time he had read him a bedtime story? Taught him something new? He didn't even know Liam's favorite color anymore. As the wrought iron gates to his sprawling mansion creaked open, Alexander dismissed the driver and stepped out of the car himself. The estate loomed before him, a grand monument to his success, but it felt cold, lifeless. The lights in the main house were dimmed, save for a faint glow coming from the backyard. Curiosity piqued. Alexander decided to forgo the front entrance and follow the light. He moved quietly, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel pathway. As he approached the backyard, he heard a soft, melodic voice. Ava's voice. The nanny he had hired on a glowing recommendation 6 months ago. Alexander had barely spoken to her, trusting his assistant's judgment, but he knew she had a reputation for being kind, yet firm. A perfect balance for Liam. What he saw next made him stop dead in his tracks. Under the soft glow of fairy lights strung around the backyard, Eva knelt on the grass beside Liam. The boy's hands were clasped together, his small face tilted up toward the sky. Eva's hands gently covered his, her voice steady and soothing as she guided him through what appeared to be a prayer. "Close your eyes, Liam," she whispered, her tone warm and reassuring. "Feel the breeze, hear the sounds around you. And now, think of something you're thankful for." Liam's voice, small but earnest, broke the stillness. "I'm thankful for Mommy, and for you, Ava, and I hope Daddy comes home soon." Alexander's chest tightened. He wasn't a religious man, and the sight of his son praying was foreign to him. He'd always believed in hard work, not divine intervention. Yet the moment felt strangely intimate, almost sacred. He wanted to walk away, to give them their space, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his heart battling conflicting emotions. Eva smiled at Liam, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Your daddy loves you very much, Liam," she said softly, "even when he's far away." The words stung. Alexander had never questioned his love for his son, but hearing it said aloud, especially by someone who seemed to know Liam better than he did, was like a knife to his gut. As the moment lingered, something about Eva struck him as profoundly different. She wasn't just a nanny doing her job. The care in her voice, the tenderness in her actions. She was filling a void he hadn't even realized existed. Before he could process further, Liam spotted him. "Daddy!" the boy shouted, springing to his feet and racing toward him. Alexander forced a smile as he crouched to catch his son in a hug, his arms wrapping around the small, warm body. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I missed you." Eva rose to her feet, her expression a mix of surprise and something else, an emotion Alexander couldn't quite name. "Mr. Drake," she said, her voice polite but tinged with hesitation. "I didn't expect you back so soon." Alexander straightened, holding Liam's hand as he looked at her. "Clearly," he said, his tone clipped. "I didn't realize you were teaching my son to pray." Eva didn't flinch. She met his gaze head on, her green eyes steady. "Liam misses his mother," she said simply. "Sometimes talking to someone who's no longer here helps." Alexander's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to assert his authority, but he couldn't ignore the soft glow of contentment on Liam's face. Instead, he gave a curt nod and led his son inside, leaving Eva standing alone under the fairy lights. As he climbed the stairs to Liam's room, his mind churned. Eva's words, her presence, they unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, Alexander felt like an outsider in his own home, and that terrified him. The morning sun streamed through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the mansion's dining room, painting the polished mahogany table in hues of gold. Alexander sat at the head of the table, nursing a cup of coffee, his thoughts restless. He'd barely slept after the encounter the night before. Eva's actions lingered in his mind, her calm defiance, her earnestness in speaking to Liam, and the way she didn't shrink under his scrutiny. Liam burst into the room, his face lit with excitement. "Daddy, Eva and I are going to plant a garden today. Want to help?" Alexander blinked, caught off guard. "A garden?" "Yeah," Liam grinned, his energy infectious. "She said we can grow our own vegetables. Isn't that cool?" Alexander opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps. Eva appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. She was dressed in casual jeans and a crisp white shirt that made her look effortlessly elegant. "Good morning, Mr. Drake," she greeted him with a polite nod. "Liam and I have been planning this for a while. I thought it would be a good way to teach him patience and responsibility." "Patience and responsibility," Alexander repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "Through gardening?" Eva met his gaze, her expression neutral but unwavering. "Yes, it's important for children to learn that not everything in life comes instantly. Sometimes the most rewarding things take time." Alexander couldn't decide if he was impressed or annoyed. "And I suppose you'll be teaching him other lessons too?" "If they're important for his growth, then yes," Eva replied smoothly, her voice carrying just enough edge to signal she wasn't intimidated. "Daddy, please come help us." Liam tugged at his sleeve, cutting through the tension. Alexander glanced at his son, whose eager eyes sparkled with hope. Against his better judgment, he found himself nodding. Outside, the mansion's sprawling backyard was alive with the sounds of birds and the soft hum of the breeze. A patch of soil had already been prepared near the edge of the lawn, and a collection of small plants sat neatly in pots nearby. Eva handed Liam a pair of small gardening gloves and then turned to Alexander. "We could use an extra pair of hands." Alexander hesitated, unused to being drawn into such casual activities. "I'm not exactly dressed for gardening," he muttered, gesturing to his tailored slacks and shirt. Eva raised an eyebrow. "I think you'll survive. It's good for Liam to see his father getting involved." The comment was pointed but not unkind. Alexander sighed, rolled up his sleeves, and crouched beside Liam. "All right, kiddo. What's first?" Liam beamed. "We dig the holes for the plants," he declared, picking up a small trowel. "Eva says the roots need room to grow." As they worked, Alexander noticed how naturally Eva guided Liam, encouraging him with gentle words and demonstrating each step with patience. She explained how the roots of a plant needed nourishment and care, drawing parallels to life in a way that even Alexander found oddly compelling. "When you plant something," Eva said, patting the soil around a young tomato plant, "you're making a promise to take care of it. It won't grow overnight, but if you're consistent, it'll reward you." Alexander, who was awkwardly covering a plant with soil, couldn't resist a quip. "Sounds like a metaphor you use often." Eva looked up, her green eyes meeting his with a spark of humor. "It's a good one. People need nurturing too, Mr. Drake, especially children." The words hung in the air. Alexander glanced at Liam, who was happily patting down the dirt with his small hands. Guilt prickled at the edges of his mind. He'd been so consumed by work that he'd overlooked how much nurturing his son might need. Later, as they watered the freshly planted garden, Liam turned to Eva. Do you think Mommy can see us planting these? Eva crouched beside him, her expression softening. I think she would be very proud of you, Liam. You're doing something beautiful. Alexander froze. He hadn't expected Claire to be brought up so casually. Watching Eva handle the delicate topic with such grace made him feel both grateful and uneasy. It was a reminder of how absent he had been in helping Liam process his grief. After Liam ran off to wash his hands, Alexander approached Eva. You seem to have a knack for everything. Eva shrugged, brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. I just try to give Liam what he needs. Children need to feel connected to something, whether it's people, memories, or even the earth. Alexander crossed his arms, studying her. And what about you? What do you need? The question caught her off guard. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. That's not important, Mr. Drake. My job is to focus on Liam. Her answer felt rehearsed, as though she were hiding a deeper truth. Alexander didn't press further, but the mystery surrounding her gnawed at him. Who was this woman who had so seamlessly filled the gaps in his son's life? And why did she seem so determined to keep her own life out of view? That night, as Alexander sat in his study, he stared out at the newly planted garden under the moonlight. He couldn't shake the feeling that Eva was more than just a nanny. She was teaching Liam things that Alexander himself couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't. And as much as he hated to admit it, she was beginning to teach him too. The soft hum of the espresso machine in the kitchen was the only sound in the otherwise silent mansion. Alexander stood by the counter, gripping a freshly brewed cup of coffee, his mind racing. The events of the past few days had unsettled him. He couldn't ignore the changes in Liam. He seemed happier, more animated, and far more expressive than Alexander had seen in years. And at the center of it all was Eva Hart, the nanny who seemed to have effortlessly stepped into the role of a guide, a teacher, and something Alexander couldn't quite define. The memory of the prayer still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the act itself. It was what it symbolized. It felt like Eva was introducing something to his son that Alexander had no control over. For a man who had built an empire by maintaining control, the thought was intolerable. Determined to re-establish boundaries, Alexander made his way to Eva's quarters. Her room was tucked away in a quieter wing of the mansion, modest compared to the rest of the opulent estate. He knocked twice, and when she opened the door, he was struck by the calm composure in her expression, as if she had been expecting him. Mr. Drake, she said, stepping aside to let him in. Is everything all right? Alexander stepped into the room, his towering frame nearly filling the small space. His eyes briefly scanned the room, books neatly stacked on a shelf, a framed photo of a young boy on the nightstand, and a well-worn notebook resting on the desk. The space was simple, almost austere, but it carried an air of warmth that he couldn't ignore. We need to talk, he said, his tone brisk. Eva closed the door and turned to face him, her hands clasped in front of her. Of course. Is it about Liam? It's about what I saw last night, he said, his voice low but firm. The prayer. Eva tilted her head slightly, her expression steady. I see. And what about it concerns you? Alexander's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected her to be so direct. I hired you to take care of my son, to ensure his safety and well-being, not to teach him your personal beliefs. Her calm demeanor didn't falter. Liam has questions, Mr. Drake. He misses his mother. He's trying to understand a world that doesn't make sense to him. I'm simply giving him tools to cope. Tools, Alexander repeated, his voice sharp. I don't believe in filling his head with ideas that have no basis in reality. Eva's eyes flashed with something, frustration perhaps, or defiance. And what would you prefer I do, Mr. Drake? Ignore his questions? Pretend his grief doesn't exist? Her words hit him like a blow. Alexander set his coffee cup down on the desk, his jaw tightening. I prefer that you stick to what I hired you for. If Liam has questions, I'll handle them. Ava's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she seemed to weigh her next words carefully. With all due respect, Mr. Drake, when was the last time you had a real conversation with Liam? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Alexander's silence was answer enough. Ava took a step closer, her voice softening but losing none of its firmness. Liam looks up to you. He craves your attention, your guidance. But he also misses his mother in ways he doesn't fully understand. If you won't help him navigate those feelings, someone has to. Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. You're overstepping, Ava. Am I? She countered, her tone steady. Or am I doing what's necessary for a child who needs more than just a roof over his head and food on the table? Alexander stared at her, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, guilt, and something he couldn't quite name. Eva didn't back down, her green eyes locked on his, unyielding yet filled with compassion. It was unnerving. For years he had surrounded himself with people who deferred to him, who never questioned his authority. But Eva wasn't like them. She wasn't afraid to challenge him. I won't apologize for trying to help Liam, she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. But if you truly believe I'm doing more harm than good, then you're free to replace me. The words stung more than Alexander cared to admit. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. You've made your point, he said gruffly. But this prayer nonsense stops. Understood? Eva nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't entirely agree. Understood, Mr. Drake. Satisfied, or at least pretending to be, Alexander left the room without another word. But as he walked back to his study, he couldn't shake the conversation. Eva's words replayed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. That night, Alexander found himself sitting in Liam's room, watching his son sleep. The boy's small frame rose and fell with each breath, his face peaceful in slumber. Alexander felt a pang of regret. Eva was right. He hadn't been the father Liam needed. He had buried himself in work, using it as a shield against his own grief, and in doing so, he had left his son to navigate his pain alone. For the first time in years, Alexander wondered if the walls he had built around himself were doing more harm than good, not just to him, but to the one person who needed him most. It had been a week since Alexander's confrontation with Eva, and despite his best efforts to remain distant, he found himself increasingly drawn to the subtle changes she was bringing to Liam's life, and, by extension, to his own. The mansion, once cold and sterile, now hummed with life. Liam's laughter echoed through the halls, and small things, like the colorful drawings on the fridge or the faint scent of freshly baked cookies, began to disrupt Alexander's carefully curated routine. One evening, after an intense day at work, Alexander stepped out onto the terrace with a glass of scotch. He glanced at the garden below, which had become Eva and Liam's favorite project. Twilight painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, and the faint sound of Eva's laughter reached him. Curious, Alexander walked toward the garden, his footsteps muffled by the grass. He paused just behind a tall hedge when he heard Eva's voice. I can't let him find out the truth, she said softly. Alexander's breath caught. Who was she talking about? And what truth? I don't care how long it takes, she continued. I'll make it right. Peeking through the foliage, Alexander saw her holding a phone to her ear, pacing nervously. She stopped suddenly, her expression tense. I've already risked too much by being here. If he... She paused, glancing toward the house. I have to go. Alexander quickly retreated, his mind racing. Ava hung up the phone and returned to kneeling by the garden, humming softly as she tended to the plants. She looked calm, even serene, but Alexander now knew there was something more beneath the surface. As he walked back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eva wasn't just a nanny trying to help his son. She was hiding something, something big. The following weekend, Liam came bounding into Alexander's study, practically vibrating with excitement. "Daddy! Daddy! Eva says we should go to the beach today. Can we? Please?" Alexander glanced up from his laptop, his first instinct to decline. He had a mountain of emails to get through and an important deal that needed his attention. But then he saw the hopeful look on Liam's face, the same one that had been missing for so long. "All right," he said, surprising even himself. "Let's go to the beach." The drive to the coast was filled with Liam's chatter, his excitement contagious. Ava sat in the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the sunlight streaming through the window. Alexander stole glances at her, his curiosity about her deepening with each passing moment. Who was this woman who had managed to crack the walls he had spent years building? When they arrived, Liam bolted toward the sand, his small feet kicking up clouds of it as he ran. Eva laughed, chasing after him. Alexander followed at a slower pace, unsure of what to do. It had been years since he'd done anything so normal. Eva and Liam were already knee-deep in the water when Alexander finally joined them. Liam splashed him immediately, giggling uncontrollably. For the first time in years, Alexander laughed. A real, unguarded laugh. It startled him, but it felt good. As the day went on, Alexander found himself relaxing. He helped Liam build sandcastles, burying his hands in the warm, gritty sand. Eva showed Liam how to collect seashells, her smile radiant as she held up a particularly colorful one. Alexander couldn't help but notice how natural she was with his son, how easily she brought joy into their lives. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, the three of them sat on a blanket, watching the waves crash against the shore. Liam had fallen asleep, his head resting on Eva's lap. Alexander found himself glancing at her more often than he intended. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Eva looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For everything," he said, his voice quieter. "For helping Liam. For bringing some light back into his life." Eva hesitated as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Instead, she gave him a small smile. "Liam deserves happiness. So do you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Alexander allowed himself to believe them. As they packed up and headed back to the car, Alexander couldn't shake the nagging questions in his mind. Eva had brought so much good into their lives, but her conversation in the garden haunted him. Who was she, really? And what was she hiding? That night, long after Liam had been tucked into bed, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed her name into a search engine. Eva Hart. The results were sparse, almost too sparse. There were no social media profiles, no detailed records. It was as if she had deliberately erased parts of her past. The unease that had been building in Alexander's chest grew stronger. He didn't want to doubt her, but the evidence, or lack thereof, was impossible to ignore. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find out the truth. The sun had barely risen when Alexander found himself pacing the hallway outside Eva's quarters. The questions swirling in his mind wouldn't let him rest. After their day at the beach, he had been even more captivated by her presence, but the conversation he had overheard and her guarded nature nagged at him. He needed answers. His footsteps faltered in front of her door. The mansion was still quiet, the staff not yet bustling about their morning duties. Taking a deep breath, he turned the doorknob. It wasn't locked. Eva's room was exactly as he remembered from his brief visit, a simple, cozy space that seemed worlds apart from the grandeur of the rest of the house. His gaze landed on her desk, where the same worn notebook he had noticed before now sat neatly closed. It looked personal, intimate. Hesitating only for a moment, he reached for it. The leather cover felt soft beneath his fingers, the pages slightly frayed. As he flipped it open, the faint scent of lavender drifted up, mingling with the paper. The first few pages were filled with notes in tidy handwriting, lists of activities for Liam, meal plans, and ideas for educational games. But as he turned the pages, the content shifted. It became more personal, more raw. One entry caught his eye. "I didn't think it would feel this complicated. When I took this job, it was supposed to be about justice, about finding a way to make things right for my brother. But now there's Liam, and Alexander." Alexander's stomach tightened. His brother? Justice? He read on, his pulse quickening. "If Alexander ever found out why I really took this job, he'd never forgive me. But what choice did I have? My brother needs me. And they, his company, took everything from us." The words hit him like a physical blow. His company? What was she talking about? The implications swirled in his mind, dark and confusing. He flipped to another entry, desperate for clarity. "It's hard to hate him when I see the way he looks at Liam, the way he tries, even though he doesn't know how. He's not the man I expected. But none of this changes what I have to do." Alexander slammed the diary shut, his breathing uneven. She had come here with an agenda, a purpose that had nothing to do with caring for his son. But what was it? And how much of what she had shared, the moments they'd spent together, was real? Unable to stop himself, Alexander skimmed through the rest of the diary. Slowly, a picture began to form. Eva's brother, Theo, had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive illness. The treatment was costly, far beyond what Eva could afford. The situation was further complicated by an environmental disaster in their hometown. A disaster linked to one of Alexander's subsidiary companies. Toxic waste had leaked into the local water supply, and though the company had denied any wrongdoing, several families, including Eva's, had been affected. Ava's diary revealed the depth of her desperation. She had taken the job in Alexander's home to gain access to him, to find a way to hold him accountable. But as the weeks had turned into months, her motives had grown tangled. Liam had softened her resolve, and so apparently had Alexander. Alexander closed the diary and leaned back in Eva's chair, his mind racing. He wanted to feel anger, rage even, but instead a strange sense of betrayal gnawed at him. Eva's care for Liam, the way she had brought light back into their lives, it had all felt so genuine. Was it possible for someone to act so selflessly while harboring such ulterior motives? Or was there more to her story than he could glean from these pages? His thoughts were interrupted by a small voice behind him. "Daddy, what are you doing in Eva's room?" Alexander turned sharply to see Liam standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. The sight of his son jolted him back to reality. He quickly set the diary back on the desk and rose to his feet. "I was just—" He hesitated, unsure of what to say. "I needed to check something." Liam tilted his head, confused. "Is Eva okay?" Alexander crouched down to his son's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Eva's fine, buddy. Go back to bed, all right? It's still early." Liam nodded reluctantly and shuffled back to his room. Once he was gone, Alexander turned back to the desk, his resolve hardening. He couldn't ignore what he had discovered. Whatever Eva's intentions, she had stepped into his world and made a place for herself in it. A place he wasn't sure he could now imagine her leaving. But before he could confront her, he needed the full story. By the time Eva emerged from her room later that morning, Alexander had already made up his mind. He would confront her, but not yet. He needed to hear her side, to see if the warmth she brought to their lives was genuine or part of a carefully crafted act. As he watched her move about the kitchen with Liam, her laughter filling the space, Alexander felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Was it regret? Hope? Or just the realization that despite everything, he wasn't sure he wanted her to leave? The air was heavy with tension that evening. Alexander's discovery of Eva's diary had ignited a storm of questions, but he couldn't bring himself to confront her yet. He needed clarity, needed to understand the woman who had unknowingly started to change not just Liam's life, but his own. As the evening wore on, Alexander found himself gravitating toward the backyard, where Eva often spent her quiet moments after Liam had gone to bed. He stepped outside, his footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. The moonlight bathed the garden in a pale glow, illuminating Eva's figure as she sat on a wooden bench, her face tilted toward the stars. She looked peaceful, yet there was a shadow in her eyes, as if she carried a weight far heavier than she let on. "You're out late," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Eva startled slightly but quickly regained her composure. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, offering him a small smile. "The garden's my favorite place to think." Alexander hesitated, then sat down beside her. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken words. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the night breeze. "Liam seems happier," Alexander said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Since you came into our lives." Eva glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "He's a wonderful boy. He just needed someone to remind him how to laugh." "And me?" Alexander asked, his tone almost self-deprecating. "What do I need?" Eva's smile faltered. She turned her gaze back to the garden, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I think you already know the answer to that." Alexander frowned, her cryptic response unsettling him. "Why do you always do that?" "Do what?" "Deflect," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "You spend all your time focusing on Liam, on making sure he's happy. But you never talk about yourself. What are you running from?" Eva stiffened, the vulnerability in her eyes replaced by caution. "I'm not running," she said quietly. "I'm just trying to make the best of the situation I've been given." Alexander didn't miss the flicker of pain in her voice. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "You're allowed to ask for help, Eva. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Eva let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Help doesn't come without a price, Mr. Drake. I learned that a long time ago." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He leaned back, studying her. "Is that why you came here? For help?" She froze, her hands tightening in her lap. For a moment, she seemed to consider her response, but then she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "It's more complicated than that." "Try me," Alexander pressed. Eva hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother is sick, very sick, and the treatment he needs is impossible to afford. When I heard about this job, I thought it might be a way to save him." Alexander's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to admit it so openly. "Why not just ask for help?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Eva's eyes met his, a mixture of sadness and defiance in her gaze. "Because asking for help wouldn't change the fact that your company, your subsidiary, caused this in the first place." The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Alexander stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You're blaming me?" "I'm blaming the system," Eva said, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "You may not have known, but people in my town are still suffering from what your company did. My brother was just a boy when the water made him sick, and while you were building your empire, we were left to fend for ourselves." Alexander stared at her, the weight of her accusations sinking in. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't deny the possibility that she was right. His business was vast, and while he prided himself on his ethics, he knew not every corner of his empire was as clean as he wanted to believe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night air seemed to grow heavier, the silence pressing down on them. Finally, Eva broke the tension. "I don't hate you," she said quietly. "I wanted to. When I took this job, I told myself you were just another greedy tycoon who didn't care about the lives his company destroyed. But then I met Liam, and I saw you, and I realized it's not that simple." Alexander's throat tightened. He didn't know how to respond to her words. how to reconcile the anger she must have felt with the kindness she had shown his son. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Would you have believed me?" Eva countered. "Would you have cared?" Her words stung because he wasn't sure of the answer. The man he had been before losing Claire, before shutting himself off from the world, might have dismissed her entirely. But the man sitting beside her now felt different, changed by her presence, by the light she had brought back into his life. "I would have listened," he said finally. "Or at least I hope I would have." Eva's expression softened, but the sadness in her eyes remained. "It doesn't matter now. I stayed because of Liam. He doesn't deserve to suffer for the mistakes of adults. Neither do you." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the conversation settling over them. For the first time, Alexander felt the cracks in his carefully constructed world widening, letting in a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "I'll look into it," he said suddenly. Eva looked at him, surprised. "What?" "The claims against my company," he clarified. "I'll look into them. If what you're saying is true, I'll fix it. For your brother. For everyone." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed unsure whether to believe him. But then she nodded, her expression softening into something that looked almost like gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Alexander nodded, his gaze drifting back to the garden. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose beyond his work, beyond his grief. And though he couldn't explain it, he knew Eva had something to do with it. The morning after his conversation with Eva, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the sleek laptop in front of him. Her words from the previous night echoed in his mind, refusing to let him rest. "My brother was just a boy when the water made him sick." If there was even a grain of truth to her claim, he needed to know. He owed it to her, to Liam, to himself. Alexander rarely delved into the day-to-day operations of his subsidiaries. He had trusted his senior executives to handle those details. But now he realized that trust might have been misplaced. He opened an encrypted file on his laptop containing a database of all his company's projects, lawsuits, and settlements. His fingers hesitated before typing the name of the town Eva had mentioned, Ridgewater. The search returned several documents. Among them was a lengthy report on an environmental incident 5 years ago. The details were damning. A chemical plant owned by one of his subsidiaries, Ricin Industries, had leaked toxic waste into the local water supply. The contamination had led to a spike in illnesses among the town's residents, including cases of cancer, neurological disorders, and other debilitating conditions. While the company had initially denied any wrongdoing, an internal investigation had confirmed the leak. Rather than address the issue transparently, Rasan had quietly settled with a handful of families, leaving many others, including Eva's, to bear the burden alone. Alexander's stomach churned as he read the report. How could something like this have slipped through the cracks? He prided himself on running an ethical business, but this was a stain on his empire, and on his conscience. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. Eva had been right all along. His company had destroyed lives, and he had been too removed, too focused on expansion and profits to notice. Determined to understand the full scope of what had happened, Alexander requested a meeting with one of his legal advisors, Harold, who had been involved in the Ridgewater case. Within an hour, Harold was sitting across from him, his expression uneasy. "I assume you've seen the report?" Harold said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I've seen enough to know that my company failed those people," Alexander said, his voice cold. "What I don't understand is why I wasn't informed." Harold hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "We thought it best not to burden you with smaller issues. Ryson's executives assured us the matter was being handled." "Smaller issues?" Alexander's voice rose, his frustration evident. "People's lives were destroyed because of our negligence. That's not a smaller issue. That's a failure. a catastrophic one. Harold flinched under Alexander's glare. The settlements were generous, he offered weakly. Most of the families accepted them. And those who didn't? Alexander demanded. What about the ones who couldn't afford to fight us? Harold's silence was all the confirmation Alexander needed. Later that evening, Alexander sat in the darkened study, nursing a glass of scotch. He had built his company on the belief that it could change lives for the better, yet here was undeniable proof that it had also caused irreparable harm. And Eva, she had carried the weight of this betrayal into his home, into Liam's life, without ever saying a word to him directly. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Before he could respond, Eva stepped inside, her expression cautious. "Liam's asleep," she said softly. "I thought I'd check on you." Alexander looked up at her, the weight of the day's revelations evident in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low but intense. Eva hesitated, clearly unsure of what he meant. "Tell you what?" "About Ridgewater. About what my company did to your family." Her face paled and she took an involuntary step back. "You found out." "I read the report," Alexander said, setting his glass down. "I know about the leak, the settlements, your brother." Eva wrapped her arms around herself, her posture defensive. "I didn't think you'd care," she admitted. "You're the head of a billion-dollar empire. Why would you care about one small town?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "You thought I wouldn't care, yet you still came here. Why?" Her gaze faltered, but then she lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with quiet defiance. "At first, it was about Theo, my brother. I thought if I could get close enough to you, I could make you see the damage your company caused, but then," she trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. "Then I met Liam, and I saw how much he needed someone, and how much you needed someone, even if you didn't realize it." Alexander's chest tightened at her words. "So what was the plan? To make me fall for you? To manipulate me into helping you?" "No!" Eva's voice was sharp, her eyes flashing with emotion. "I never planned for any of this to happen. I never planned to care about you. Or Liam." Her admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alexander studied her, his emotions a confusing mix of anger, betrayal, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Finally, he broke the silence. "You should have told me." "And what would you have done?" Eva asked, her voice trembling. "Would you have believed me? Would you have even listened?" Alexander couldn't answer. The truth was, the man he had been 6 months ago, the man who buried himself in work to avoid dealing with his grief, might not have listened. But now, after everything Eva had done for Liam, for their home, he couldn't dismiss her so easily. "I'm going to fix this," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not just for your brother, but for everyone in Ridgewater." Eva's eyes widened in surprise. You mean that?" "I mean it," Alexander said firmly. "I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way." Tears welled in Ava's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander nodded, his expression softening. "You didn't have to carry this alone, Eva. You should have trusted me." She looked away, her voice barely audible. "It's hard to trust someone when the stakes are so high." For the first time, Alexander truly understood the depth of her struggle, and as he looked at her, standing there with so much pain and strength in her eyes, he realized something else. He didn't want her to leave. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Alexander rose with a renewed sense of purpose. The revelations of the past few days had shaken him to his core, but they had also ignited something he hadn't felt in years, a drive to not just protect what he had built, but to fix the harm it had caused. He contacted his legal team and demanded a full audit of Ryzen Industries, ordering complete transparency and action to address the damage in Ridgewater. By mid-afternoon, Eva had sensed the shift in Alexander's demeanor. He was quieter, more contemplative, and his interactions with Liam were unusually attentive. But the tension between them remained unspoken, lingering like a storm waiting to break. Later that evening, as Eva was helping Liam with his bedtime routine, Alexander knocked softly on the door. "Can I join you?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Liam's face lit up. "Of course, Daddy. Eva's reading me a story." Alexander took a seat on the edge of the bed as Eva continued reading. Her voice was calm, soothing, but Alexander noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she held the book. When the story ended, and Liam's eyes grew heavy with sleep, Alexander brushed his son's hair back gently, something he hadn't done in years. "Good night, buddy," he whispered. Once Liam was asleep, Alexander gestured for Eva to follow him into the study. She hesitated, but eventually nodded, her expression wary. In the study, Alexander closed the door behind her. The warm glow of the fireplace softened the tension in the room, but Eva stood near the door, her arms crossed defensively. "I'm not angry with you," Alexander began, his voice calm but firm, "but I can't ignore what's happened." Eva's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her guard remained up. "I never meant for it to go this far," she admitted. "I never wanted to deceive you." "You didn't deceive me," Alexander said, stepping closer. "You protected your brother. You fought for your family. I can respect that. But what I can't understand is why you thought I wouldn't care." Eva hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I've seen people like you before, powerful, untouchable. They don't care about people like me, about people like Theo." "Well, you were wrong," Alexander said, his tone sharp but not unkind. "I care. I may not have known what was happening in Ridgewater, but now that I do, I'll fix it. You have my word." Tears welled in Eva's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander's voice softened. "But this isn't just about Ridgewater, Eva. This is about us. About what's happening between us. I need to know what's real. Was it all part of the plan?" Eva's breath hitched, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan to feel this way, Alexander. But everything I've done for Liam, for you, it's real. I care about both of you, more than I ever thought possible." Alexander studied her, searching for any sign of deceit, but all he saw was honesty. He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Then we'll figure this out, together." Over the next few weeks, Alexander threw himself into rectifying the wrongs of his company. He met with the remaining families in Ridgewater, including Eva's, and publicly acknowledged the company's role in the contamination. He established a fund to cover medical expenses for the victims and implemented stricter oversight for all his subsidiaries. The media coverage was intense, but Alexander faced it head-on, determined to show that he was more than just a businessman. He was a man willing to take responsibility. During this time, Eva stood by his side. Though their relationship was still fragile, their shared goal of helping others brought them closer together. Liam, unaware of the complexities between the two adults he loved most, thrived in the newfound warmth and stability of their home. One crisp autumn evening, Alexander invited Eva and Liam to the garden. It was the same spot where Eva had first taught Liam to pray, and now the once barren patch of soil was flourishing with vegetables and flowers. Liam ran ahead, excitedly pointing out the tomatoes and sunflowers they had planted months ago. As Eva admired the garden, Alexander turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You've changed this place, Eva. You've changed me." Eva looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You've changed too, Alexander. You let yourself feel again. That takes more strength than most people realize." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I don't want to face it without you. You and Liam, you're my family now." Ava's breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. We'll figure it out. Together. As the three of them sat together in the garden that evening, Ava's phone buzzed with a text. She glanced at it briefly and froze. Alexander noticed the change in her expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. Eva hesitated, then handed him the phone. The message was from a lawyer representing a group of Ridgewater families who were suing the former executives of Rice and Industries. It read, "We've uncovered new evidence. The negligence wasn't an accident. They tried to cover it up." Alexander's jaw tightened as he read the message. He had assumed the incident was a tragic mistake, but now it seemed there was more to the story. Eva looked at him, her expression filled with both fear and hope. "What do we do now?" Alexander's gaze hardened with determination. "We finish what we started. Together." Months later, the lawsuit against Rison's former executives culminated in a landmark victory for the Ridgewater families. Alexander's leadership in addressing the crisis earned him respect from both the public and his peers, but what mattered most to him was the peace it brought to Eva's family. Theo, now receiving the treatment he needed, began to recover, and for the first time in years, Eva allowed herself to dream of a future filled with hope. In the garden where it all began, Alexander knelt before Eva, holding a small box in his hand. "Eva Hart," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You came into our lives when we needed you most. You taught me how to feel again, how to fight for what matters. Will you stay with us? Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Eva's face as she nodded, her heart full. "Yes." 1,000 times. "Yes." As Liam ran toward them, cheering, Alexander and Eva embraced, the weight of the past finally lifting. Together they had built something beautiful, proof that even the most broken lives could bloom again.